All right. Good morning. We are back. It is on Thursday that you're probably checking this out. So we're glad to have you back. Glad to see you made it through a couple days and are joining us again. You're at Tiny Desk Devotion. My name is Justin. I'm the pastor here at United Church of Lincoln, and we are continuing Tiny Desk Devotion in some form to get us to stop and ask questions of how God is interacting in our lives today, how the divine is speaking to us to think about how we view the world, how we are viewing our interactions with others, how we are engaging with creation, not being separated from it, but engaging with creation. And so right now we're asking those questions. We've been asking it since we started doing Tiny Desk Devotions, but really with an intentionality since we went into this new book that we're going through together called Discernment by Henry Nouwen. And so last week, or I'm sorry, not last week, earlier this week, we talked about this idea of Kairos time versus Chronos time, and how there are things that there are movements, there is God's time, and how God's time kind of calls us into these movements and these moments where it seems like something's happening, and it's a collective. It's not just, and it can be on the individual level too, but it's also like, you look at your neighbor and you're like, you feel something like something's changing right now. We should pay attention to that change. What is God trying to tell us? And that leads to some of what Nouwen has already talked about in some previous chapters that we read of people that are put in our pathways. So we ask these people, like, man, are you sensing what I'm sensing, or what angle are you coming from when you check this out? So anyway, we're going to jump back in today and go to the critical events that can reveal divine purpose. We'll put some time into that. And so if you hear something, if something comes out to you, hang with it. You don't have to skip over it. So look into that. And then you can always come back and listen to the other parts later to pick up on if you kind of miss anything. But let's jump in, and then at the very end, I'll mention some things that stuck out to me. All right, here we go. Life is God's initiative and can end or change suddenly, unexpectedly, and unpredictably. When we humans are ready to give up hope and resign ourselves to the inevitable, God intervenes and reveals completely new beginnings. The resurrection of Jesus is God's sign breaking through every form of human fatalism and despair. In every critical event, there is an opportunity for God to act creatively and reveal a deeper truth than what we see on the surface of things. God also can turn around critical incidents and seemingly hopeless situations in our lives and reveal light in the darkness. For example, almost a year before making L'Arche Daybreak my home, and he talked about that in some other chapters about going to this intentional community where there were people there who have different forms of disabilities. And so L'Arche is where that kind of takes place. So that's what he's talking about, that community. I visited the community for several days. I had a chance to meet all the assistants and community members and celebrated the Eucharist with some of them, Eucharist, Lord's Supper, communion. While I was there, Raymond, one of the core community members, was hit by a car while crossing a busy street and thrown into the air. Many of his ribs were broken and one lung collapsed. I went twice to the hospital to visit Raymond, pray with him, and assure him of our love. It was so sad to see him on a respirator and unable to talk to us. His situation was critical and death seemed imminent. We later returned to the hospital and found Raymond heavily sedated, but the doctor and nurse said there was still hope. The community united in their support and prayers for Raymond. The next morning around 10 o'clock, Ray's father called and told us the good news: their son was doing better. There was no immediate danger of death. Before leaving Toronto as planned, I returned to the hospital once more to say goodbye to Raymond and his parents. I showed Ray's father how to make the sign of the cross on Ray's forehead. He never had done this before and cried as he signed his son in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. A father's blessing can be so healing. God, I'm going to make a little note of that. I got some thoughts on that. God spoke clearly to me into the L'Arche Daybreak community through the critical incident requiring pastoral care. During my 9 days at Daybreak, I came to feel like an intimate part of the intense joys and sorrows of this community of care. I developed a deep sense for the core members and their assistants who received me with such warm hospitality. They did not hide anything from me. They allowed me to see their fears and their love. I felt deeply, deeply grateful for having been part of it all. I reflected on this tender time over the next several months. I came to see how God had granted me the first glimpse of a new vocation and a place where I could grow into his purpose for me. God used that time to plant the seeds of L'Arche Daybreak for my future pastoral ministry there. The Daybreak community also reflected on our time together and discerned that it would be good to call me to be their pastor. A year later, after what might be called a double discernment, I joined the community as an assistant and resident priest and pastor. In retrospect, many of the good and important things that have happened to me in my life were completely unexpected, and many things that I thought would happen to me did not occur. As I reflect on this reality, it is clear that God is present in the events of my life, yet I act and speak as if I'm in control. But if the future is not in my hands, then I have all the more reason to stay in the present and give honor and glory to God from where I am, trusting that God is the God of life who makes everything new. Who knows where you or I will be next year on June 7th? So why worry about it? God will surprise us. Thomas Merton, he's always talking about Merton, also viewed the critical events of his life as signposts. Oh, I like the term signposts. I like that. To the will of God. For example, after the first visit to Gethsemane Abbey in 1941, Merton wrote in his journal, "I desire only one thing, to love God, to follow his will." One thing real fast, you can obviously tell this book's a little bit older, but you're getting a person who is a mature age, and they're using the pronouns of God as his. So I'm not saying that's wrong or right, but it is just a perspective. We're kind of learning now. I think in an academic setting, I was taught to write God as God's self. So you didn't really prescribe a pronoun unless you're talking about the person of Jesus. But anyway, I just want to name that moving forward because I know sometimes those pronouns can be problematic. All right. Could it ever possibly mean that I might someday become a monk in this monastery? Later he wrote, why doesn't this idea of the Trappist leave me? Reflecting on this persistent feeling, an idea led him to interpret it as a sign to which he should pay attention. Merton's early preoccupation with writing and his struggle concerned whether he could do so if he left Harlem for the monastery. Perhaps what I am afraid of is to write and be rejected. Perhaps I cling to my independence, to the chance to write, to go where I like in the world. In prayerful discernment, he concluded, if God wants me to write, I can write anywhere. But going to the monastery is exciting. It fills me with awe and desire. I returned to the idea again and again. Give up everything. 2 weeks later, he reported to Gethsemane to begin his life as a monk. Small, seemingly insignificant events, ideas, and life circumstances can become occasions to discern God's will and calling in your life. Both inner and outer events and circumstances can be read and interpreted as signposts, leading into a deeper understanding of the way the Spirit of God is working in our daily lives. The more we reflect on this, the clearer it becomes that we cannot really understand God's providential work in us. In the final analysis, all we have are signs that lead us to suspect something unspeakably great, as it is written. What no eye has seen, nor ear has heard, nor the human heart conceive, what God has prepared for those who love Him. Through we see as a glass darkly, or a dark glass, we do see something. We have the freedom and responsibility to look at our lives with the eyes of faith and a heart of trust, believing that God cares and is active in our lives. Okay. Yeah. So we'll stop there, and so we'll pick this little bit of reading apart. So I really like the last part. I talked about the glass darkly. It's something that I have said from the pulpit here on a couple different ways. How I love that image of we kind of see through a glass that is not really smudged, but it's like a stained glass maybe, or it's a glass that doesn't offer just a perfect reflection or a perfect view. We can't see everything on the side, but we get glimpses of what it looks like. We can kind of make out figures of what's on the other side. So I like that, and I like how now one calls us to God that's active in our lives, and it pushes back against that idea. Well, God doesn't have any agency in the world because God has set everything in motion and then just steps back. And I don't think that's from seeing how God, and again, coming from a very Christocentric or very Christ-centric understanding of who God is. God was a person, God in the person of Jesus walked with people and was enmeshed in their lives. And so I have to believe that Jesus is an extension of God, or is in the same, operates in the same way that God does. So if Jesus is that awesome, then God has to be that awesome in the same kind of way, right? So anyway, I see that, I hear that, I read that, I discern that. So I think that God is a God who acts in our lives daily. Now, how that interaction plays out is different. Some people see that as, God saved a parking space for me, and I don't know if I get on board with that, but I do think God cares about what goes on in the day-to-day. And God reveals and shows up to us sometimes in the most miraculous ways and sometimes in the most mundane ways, which are probably miraculous too. All right, so there's that idea. And I love this image he says of signpost. I like that. Here in Vermont, I never used to notice this. I don't think it was a big deal down south. But what I like is that Vermont has a signpost for everything. So if you're going into like a bigger village, a bigger township of Middlebury, it tells you like, hey, there's a horse farm down this way. There's a restaurant this way. I'm thinking like, they would see this. I don't see this anywhere else. Like it's quaint. is what it is. It's very nice to know that the sign for the Indian restaurant is in the village, and it tells you like it's 2/10 of a mile or something like that. So the signpost that gives us where we want to go or gives an idea of where we're heading. Signposts do that. And so he ties that in with Merton, how Merton kind of read these signs. I think we all have these signs that we go to say this is kind of how I got where I got in other aspects of my life, but definitely within my faith journey. And so, I think of the signs, Lauren and I saw in coming up here. There were signs that led us to make that decision. So we had signposts too. And then kind of working backwards. Oh, I like this. And I read something similar in a book about Christian practices. So he teaches, now and obviously very, Catholic, very understanding of Catholicism, that branch or that denomination of a much larger tent of Christians. But he talks about teaching this father, who this young man has been hit by a car, and he teaches the father who was there with his son to make the sign of the cross. Yeah, I remember thinking that was just something only Catholics did. I learned that Episcopalians kind of do something similar. Some Episcopalians do, but that's the thing. I don't think anybody has a trademark. Like there's no registration on who and who can't do that. And so there are these practices that happen in other places that I don't want to say we co-opt them, that we take without thinking about why we do them. But some of these things, like the sign of the cross, I think is much bigger than just one denomination. And so I love that he kind of passes that off to someone that, at least from the assumption by my reading, was not Catholic, not brought up with that tradition. It's like, here's how you bless someone. If you've been to the river service, I don't want to say that I know that Randy did that. I know he probably did. But Randy, who was here, who was kind of like a co-pastor, assistant pastor, at a time at this church, he would do that at our river service. And if you came to, not this year because of the pandemic, but the year prior to that, we had a blessing time, I would do that too. And that's something that, that's a broader picture. So than in just one denomination. So I like that. I like that we can see and kind of pull from other things, and not trying to make them their own or not saying they don't. I think the problem is when we take them, we say, we've always been doing this and we're doing it the right way, is to acknowledge that we're kind of, we get this tradition from somewhere else and we're trying to honor that in our own way, but we want to give honor to where it came from. So I think that's important too. All right. We're going to stop there. So next week, we're going to get into the current events may contain divine message for the world. And man, who knows where that's going to take us, because we just look around at what's going on in the world right now and think, man, seems like a Kairos moment. It seems like something we should be discerning. And I'll leave you. I've said this to a few people here, and I'll leave it with this. I think I even did it from a sermon once. I remember sitting with a pastor, my pastor at my last church, and he talking about how crazy everything was in the world, and I said, "Man, sure is crazy." He told Justin, all kinds of crazy. That's true. I think the response is for us as people, they're people of faith, is what do we do with that craziness? How do we enter into it? Do we just step back and let that craziness play out, or do we get crazy right along with it? I think you got to do a little bit of both. So anyway, I appreciate you tuning in. We'll pick back up next week. As you go out into the rest of the week, into the weekend, find ways to stay happy, stay healthy, and find ways to stay at home and curb this thing, because hopefully we're going to be seeing a return to a form of normal, a new normal, within the coming months and the first of the year. All right. Talk to you all soon. Bye-bye.